There is a word that has quietly destroyed more dreams than failure ever could. It sounds harmless. It sounds patient. It sounds responsible. That word is someday. Someday I'll start the business. Someday I'll leave the relationship that drains me. Someday I'll get serious about my health. Someday I'll forgive myself. The danger of someday is that it feels like movement when it is actually delay. It gives you emotional relief without requiring action. It makes you feel like you still intend to change, so you don't have to feel guilty about staying the same. Someday is seductive because it protects your identity. As long as you say someday, you get to keep calling yourself ambitious without risking proof. You get to keep calling yourself capable without putting your skills on the line. You get to imagine the version of you that is disciplined, confident, successful, without ever facing the uncomfortable process of becoming that person. In simple terms, someday lets you fall in love with potential while avoiding reality. The real problem is not laziness. It's fear dressed up as patience. When someone says, "I'll do it someday," what they often mean is, "I'm afraid of what might happen if I try." Afraid of failing, afraid of succeeding and having to maintain it, afraid of being judged, afraid of outgrowing people. Someday becomes a psychological shield. It buys time. It keeps you safe from discomfort. But safety has a cost. Every day you choose comfort over action, your confidence quietly erodes. Here's something most people don't realize. Your brain doesn't track intentions. It tracks behavior. You might tell yourself you're going to change later, but your brain is watching what you actually do. If you consistently delay, your brain learns, we don't follow through. Over time, this becomes your identity. You don't just delay tasks, you become someone who delays life. And identity is powerful. Once you see yourself a certain way, you unconsciously act in ways that confirm it. Someday also distorts time. It tricks you into believing you have more of it than you actually do. We speak about the future as if it's guaranteed. It isn't. You don't control how much time you have. You only control what you do with today. When you push something meaningful into the future, you are gambling with a currency you do not own. And the brutal truth is this: most people do not fail because they lack talent. They fail because they assume there will always be another chance. There's another hidden cost to someday. It builds quiet resentment. When you postpone your goals long enough, you start envying the people who acted. You scroll past their wins and think, must be nice. But deep down, you know the difference wasn't luck. It was timing. They chose now. You chose later. Over time, that gap becomes bitterness, not toward them, but toward yourself. You begin to doubt your own courage. Think about relationships. How many people stay in situations that drain them because they say, someday I'll leave when the timing is right? But timing is rarely perfect. Someday becomes a way to avoid the temporary pain of change, even if staying costs you long-term peace. The same thing happens with health. Someday I'll get serious. Years pass. Energy drops. Regret grows. The cost compounds quietly, like interest on a debt you never meant to take on. The word someday also creates an illusion of control. It makes you feel like you're choosing delay, when in reality, delay is choosing you. Every time you postpone action, circumstances shift, opportunities close, people move on, markets change, energy declines. You think you're holding your place in line. You're not. The line keeps moving. On a deeper level, someday weakens self-trust. And self-trust is everything. If you cannot rely on your own word, how can you build discipline? How can you build confidence? Confidence is not built by affirmations. It is built by evidence. Small promises kept, repeatedly. When you say, someday, you are making a promise with no deadline. And a promise without a deadline is often just a dream disguised as intention. There's a harsh truth here that most people avoid. Someday is often a polite way of saying, not important enough. We make time for what feels urgent or meaningful. If something truly matters, we find a way to move toward it, even imperfectly. If we keep pushing it away, we have to ask ourselves an uncomfortable question. Do we really want this, or do we just like the idea of wanting it? The most dangerous part of someday is that it feels infinite. But your life is not infinite. Years move faster than you think. One day, you wake up and realize that someday has quietly turned into, I wish I had. And regret is heavier than effort ever was. Regret is the weight of knowing you could have tried, but chose delay instead. If you look closely, every major transformation in your life probably started with a decision that interrupted someday. A moment where you said, enough, I'm starting now. Not when you were ready. Not when it was perfect. Not when fear disappeared. But when you were tired of hearing yourself say later. Because someday doesn't steal your dreams all at once. It steals them in small, comfortable increments. And by the time you realize what it has taken, the cost is far greater than the discomfort you were trying to avoid in the first place. What makes someday even more dangerous is how socially acceptable it is. No one challenges it. If you say, I'll start next year, people nod. If you say, I'm waiting for the right time, they understand. Society rarely questions delay because most people are delaying something too, so the word becomes normalized. You are surrounded by others who are also postponing their goals, which makes your own delay feel reasonable. But normal does not mean harmless. Normal can still cost you your potential. There is also a psychological comfort in keeping goals in the future. When something lives in the future, it remains perfect. The business you haven't started yet cannot fail. The book you haven't written cannot be criticized. The version of you that works out consistently is flawless because it hasn't faced real life yet. Once you bring a goal into the present, it becomes messy. It requires sacrifice. It demands discipline. Someday keeps your dreams clean and untouched, but also unreal. Another layer most people miss is how someday drains energy. Every unfinished intention sits in your mind like an open tab on a computer. You may not think about it all day, but it's there, quietly consuming mental space. The more some days you stack up, the heavier you feel. You start saying things like, I'm overwhelmed, or I don't know where to start. But the real weight isn't the workload. It's the collection of decisions you've delayed. And here's something uncomfortable. The longer you wait, the bigger the action feels. If you say you'll start going to the gym someday, 6 months later, it feels harder than it would have today. If you delay having a difficult conversation, it grows in your head until it feels impossible. Delay magnifies fear. The mind fills the empty space with worst-case scenarios. What could have been a small step becomes a mountain because you gave it time to grow. Someday also protects ego. If you never try, you never have to measure yourself against reality. As long as your dream stays in the future, you can believe you would have succeeded if you had tried. But the moment you act, you risk discovering your limits. You risk seeing where you need improvement, and that is uncomfortable. So someday becomes a shield for pride. There is a quiet pattern that forms when someday becomes a habit. You begin to build a life based on reaction instead of intention. You handle what's urgent. You respond to what's in front of you. But you rarely move toward what truly matters to you. Years can pass this way. You stay busy, you stay responsible, but you do not move forward in the areas that would actually change your life. Think about how many people wait to feel confident before they act. Someday, when I'm more ready. But confidence is not a prerequisite. It is a byproduct. It grows after action, not before it. Waiting for motivation or clarity before you begin is like waiting to feel strong before you lift the weight. Strength is built in the lifting. There's also a financial cost to someday. Investments not made, skills not learned, risks not taken, opportunities not seized. Compounding works both ways. Small actions repeated over time create growth, but small delays repeated over time create stagnation. 10 years of small daily steps can transform your life. 10 years of small daily postponements can quietly keep you in the same place. On a deeper emotional level, constantly saying someday teaches you to tolerate dissatisfaction. You get used to living slightly below your potential, slightly unhappy, slightly unfulfilled, not miserable, just not fully alive. And that middle ground is dangerous because it doesn't hurt enough to force change. It's comfortable enough to keep you still. There's a brutal but freeing truth here. The perfect time does not exist. Conditions are never fully aligned. There will always be a reason to wait. More money, more clarity, more support, less stress. But if you study people who have built something meaningful, you'll notice a pattern. They didn't wait for perfect conditions. They worked with imperfect ones. When you replace someday with a specific date or a first small step, something shifts. The goal moves from imagination into reality. It becomes measurable. It becomes actionable, and most importantly, it becomes uncomfortable, which means it becomes real. The difference between a dreamer and a builder is not intelligence, it is not talent, it is not even resources. It is the refusal to let someday remain undefined. Builders turn someday into today, even if today is small, even if today is imperfect, even if today is uncertain. And once you begin, even in the smallest way, you interrupt the pattern. You prove to yourself that your word means something. You rebuild self-trust. You reduce mental weight. You shrink fear. You create momentum. But as long as someday stays your default answer, your future will remain a concept, not a lived experience. There is a moment in every person's life where they quietly realize they've been negotiating with themselves for years. You told yourself you would change after the holidays, after things slowed down, after you healed, after you saved more money, after someone apologized, after you felt ready. But after keeps moving. The horizon keeps shifting. And if you're honest, you begin to see a pattern, not of bad luck, not of lack of opportunity, but of delay disguised as planning. The truth is, someday keeps you emotionally comfortable, but spiritually restless. You feel the tension inside because you know you are capable of more. That tension shows up as irritation, comparison, impatience, even self-doubt. It's not that you don't believe in yourself, it's that you haven't proven yourself to yourself lately. And nothing erodes inner peace faster than knowing you are playing smaller than you could be. At some point, you have to stop asking, when will the time be right? And start asking, when will I decide? Because the time rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with a spotlight and a sign that says, now is safe. It arrives disguised as an ordinary Tuesday, an ordinary conversation, an ordinary opportunity. The only thing that makes it extraordinary is your willingness to act. You don't need a 5-year master plan to break the pattern. You need a first step, a phone call, a registration, a written page, a scheduled workout, a hard conversation. Action shrinks fear faster than thinking ever will. Movement builds clarity. The more you wait for clarity before moving, the more fog you create. The more you move, the clearer the road becomes. And here is something powerful. The moment you act, even imperfectly, you reclaim authority over your life. You stop being someone who talks about change and become someone who embodies it. That shift alone changes how you carry yourself, how you speak, how you decide. Your identity begins to update. You are no longer the person who says, someday. You are the person who says, I start. So here's what I want you to do right now. Not tomorrow, not next week, right now. Think of one thing you've been pushing into the future, just one. And instead of saying someday, give it a date. Or better yet, give it a first action within the next 24 hours. Shrink it until it's undeniable. Make it so small you cannot excuse it. And if this message hit you, if you felt even a small sting of recognition, That's not guilt. That's awareness. Don't scroll away and tell yourself you'll think about it later. Act on it. Comment below the one thing you're starting now. Declare it. Make it real. And if you're serious about breaking the cycle of delay in your life, subscribe to Psychovest and turn on notifications, because we don't just talk about growth here, we practice it. The most dangerous word is someday. The most powerful word is today. Now let's go even deeper, because this isn't just about getting things done. This is about the kind of person you are becoming every time you choose delay over decision. Every action you take casts a vote for your future identity. Every time you say today, you reinforce the identity of someone decisive, someone courageous, someone self-led. Every time you say someday, you reinforce hesitation, and identity compounds. The person you are 5 years from now is being built in small daily votes right now. You have to understand something powerful. Clarity is earned, not given. People think they need to feel certain before they move, but certainty is a result of movement. When you act, even in small ways, you gather feedback. You learn, you adjust, you grow stronger. Waiting for certainty before acting is like waiting for the map to draw itself before you take the first step. The map appears because you moved, not before. There is also a spiritual cost to postponing your own growth. When you constantly silence your inner urge to expand, you start to feel disconnected from yourself. You feel off, restless, slightly dissatisfied even when life looks fine on paper. That feeling is not random. It's the gap between who you are living as and who you know you could be. The longer that gap stays open, the heavier it feels. And here's something most people don't talk about. People around you adjust to the version of you that delays. If you've always said, "I'll do it later," people stop taking your ambitions seriously, not because they don't like you, but because your pattern trained them not to expect change. The moment you begin acting differently, some people will be surprised. Some may even feel uncomfortable. Growth disrupts expectations. But that discomfort is proof that something real is happening. The dangerous thing about someday is that it numbs urgency. It convinces you that life is a rehearsal. It isn't. This is the performance. There is no practice round. You don't get to rewind 10 years and say, "Now I'll start." The only leverage you have is now, and now is always moving. Momentum is built through immediacy, not recklessness, but immediacy. When something matters, you move toward it while the emotion is fresh. If you wait for the feeling to return later, it often fades. Inspiration has a window. Courage has a window. When you act inside that window, you strengthen it. When you ignore it, the window shrinks next time. You've probably felt it before. That moment after you finally did the thing you kept postponing. The relief, the clarity, the pride. Not because it was perfect, but because it was done. That feeling is evidence that action liberates you. It reduces mental noise. It builds trust. It aligns you with yourself. And here's the deeper shift. When you become someone who acts quickly on what matters, you stop negotiating with fear. You still feel fear, but you don't consult it for permission. You acknowledge it and move anyway. That alone separates people who transform their lives from those who remain stuck in planning mode for years. So if you've made it this far, this isn't by accident. Something inside you knows this message applies. Don't let this just be another video you agree with and move on from. Choose one area of your life, just one, where someday has been living rent-free. Replace it with a date. Replace it with a step. Replace it with movement. If this message challenged you in a real way, don't just like it, commit to it. Comment the word "today" below as a signal to yourself that you're done negotiating with delay. Share this with someone who keeps saying, "I will, someday." And if you want more content that pushes you out of comfort and into action, subscribe to Psychovest. Because growth doesn't happen in theory, it happens in decision. You don't need a new year. You don't need perfect conditions. You need a moment of honesty and the courage to move. Let's take this even further, because breaking the habit of someday is not just about productivity. It's about reclaiming power over your own narrative. Every time you delay something meaningful, you are unconsciously telling yourself that your future self will handle what your present self avoids. But your future self is not a different person. It's you, just older, just more tired, just carrying more responsibilities. When you keep handing difficult decisions to future you, you are quietly stacking pressure onto someone who hasn't even arrived yet. There's also a psychological trap in believing you'll feel different later. You think you'll be braver later, more disciplined later, more confident later. But emotions don't automatically upgrade with time. They upgrade with exposure. You don't become courageous by waiting. You become courageous by acting while your voice shakes. You don't become disciplined by planning. You become disciplined by doing what you said you would do, especially when you don't feel like it. Another truth most people overlook is that delay subtly trains you to tolerate excuses. The first time you push something off, you feel it. The second time, it stings less. By the 10th time, it feels normal. You don't even notice it anymore. And once something feels normal, you stop questioning it. That's how average becomes comfortable. That's how dreams quietly shrink without you realizing it. There's a reason decisive people appear calm. It's not because they have fewer problems. It's because they don't let decisions linger. Lingering decisions drain energy. They create background stress. They sit in your mind unfinished. The longer you let something hang over you, the more power it has over your focus. When you make a move, even a hard one, you free up mental space. You gain clarity. You move forward. Think about how many times you've replayed an idea in your head. You've imagined the outcome. You've rehearsed conversations. You've visualized success. But thinking is not building. Planning is not executing. Reflection is valuable, but only if it leads somewhere. If it doesn't, it becomes mental entertainment. It feels productive without producing anything. There is also an identity shift that happens when you stop using someday as your escape route. You begin to see yourself as someone who responds to conviction quickly. That shift changes how you approach everything. You stop waiting for motivation. You start honoring commitments. You stop romanticizing the future and start shaping it. And here's something empowering. Action doesn't require intensity. It requires consistency. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be public. It just has to be real. Small daily steps beat grand intentions that never begin. 10 minutes invested today beats a perfect plan that lives in your notes app for years. The longer you allow someday to be your answer, the more your confidence depends on imagination instead of evidence. But when you act, even imperfectly, you create proof. Proof that you can start. Proof that you can endure discomfort. Proof that you are capable of movement. And proof builds belief. If you truly want to change the trajectory of your life, stop focusing on massive reinventions. Focus on eliminating the word someday from one area at a time. Replace it with this week. Replace it with by Friday. Replace it with in the next hour. Specificity kills delay. Vagueness feeds it. You don't need more time. You need a decision. You don't need more motivation. You need a start. You don't need a perfect version of yourself to appear. You need to move with the version of yourself that exists right now. Because in the end, someday is not just a word. It's a habit. And habits shape destinies. There is something else you need to see clearly. Someday is often rooted in the illusion that you have control over timing. You tell yourself you're choosing to wait. But most of the time, waiting slowly turns into drifting. You stop steering and start reacting. Life begins to make decisions for you instead of you making decisions for your life. And when you look back years later, it doesn't feel like you chose your path. It feels like you ended up there. Another layer of this is emotional avoidance. When you say someday, you're often trying to avoid the emotional discomfort attached to the action. Starting the business might bring rejection. Leaving the relationship might bring loneliness. Going back to school might bring self-doubt. So instead of facing the emotion, you postpone the action. But here's the truth. The emotion doesn't disappear. It lingers. It resurfaces. It grows stronger because it's unresolved. Avoidance does not remove discomfort. It stretches it out over time. You also have to recognize that delay slowly lowers your standards. At first, you expect a lot from yourself. You say you want growth, discipline, transformation. But every time you postpone something important, your expectations quietly adjust downward. You begin to accept less progress, less effort, less courage. And because the shift is gradual, you barely notice it happening. Your standards don't collapse overnight, they erode. There's a powerful question you need to ask yourself. What would my life look like if I stopped giving myself indefinite extensions? Imagine if every meaningful goal had a date attached to it. Imagine if every internal promise required action within 24 hours. Your pace would change. Your mindset would change. Your results would change. Not because you suddenly became a different person, but because you removed your escape hatch. The longer you live in someday, the more you rely on hope instead of strategy. Hope says, things will align eventually. Strategy says, I will align them. Hope waits for energy. Strategy creates structure. Hope waits for inspiration. Strategy schedules effort. If you want your life to shift, you cannot rely on feelings. You need systems that force movement. And here's something deeply uncomfortable but necessary. Sometimes someday is pride disguised as patience. You don't want to start small. You don't want to look inexperienced. You don't want to be seen learning. So you wait until you can show up polished. But the irony is that mastery only comes from being willing to be a beginner. Waiting to be impressive keeps you invisible. There is also the reality of aging, not in a fearful way, but in an honest way. Your energy today is not guaranteed tomorrow. Your circumstances today are not permanent. Opportunities that feel available now may not exist later. When you delay meaningful action, you are assuming stability. But life is unpredictable. Acting now is not reckless, it is realistic. Think about the last time you felt proud of yourself. Not proud because someone praised you, but proud because you did something you kept putting off. That feeling was earned. It came from alignment between your words and your actions. That alignment is where self-respect grows, and self-respect is more powerful than motivation. The real transformation begins when you stop negotiating with yourself. When you say you will do something and you follow through, even when no one is watching, you strengthen something internal that cannot be taken from you. You become solid. You become reliable, not just to others, but to yourself. Someday weakens that solidity. It creates cracks. It introduces doubt. It keeps you in a constant state of almost starting, almost changing, almost becoming. But almost does not build a life. At some point, you have to decide that your future is worth uncomfortable action in the present. Not dramatic leaps, not reckless moves, just consistent, deliberate steps taken sooner rather than later. Because the most dangerous outcome is not failure. It is reaching the end of a season of your life and realizing you were always waiting for a version of you that never showed up, because you never gave that version a chance to be built. There is another quiet danger hidden inside the word someday. It slowly rewrites your relationship with risk. The longer you delay action, the scarier action becomes. What once felt like a manageable step starts to feel like a life-altering leap. Time exaggerates consequences in your mind. You start thinking, if I try now, it has to work, because you've waited so long. But that pressure only exists because you postponed the small steps that would have reduced the risk early on. Sometime later feels safe because it keeps your options open. You don't commit. You don't close doors. You don't fully choose. But here's the truth most people avoid. Not choosing is still a choice. Staying is a choice. Waiting is a choice. Silence is a choice. And those choices create results just as surely as bold action does. You are never neutral. You are either moving forward or reinforcing your current position. There's also the emotional toll of carrying unfinished intentions. When you constantly tell yourself you'll get to something later, your self-image begins to fragment. Part of you wants growth. Another part keeps postponing it. That internal split creates tension. You feel scattered. You feel slightly disappointed in yourself. Not because you're incapable, but because you know you're not acting in alignment with what you say you want. And here's something powerful to understand. Discipline is not built in grand moments. It is built in immediate responses. When you feel the nudge to act and you respond quickly, you strengthen that response system. When you ignore it repeatedly, you weaken it. Over time, you either train yourself to move or train yourself to hesitate. That training shapes everything: your career, your relationships, your health, your confidence. Sometime in the future also robs you of presence. Instead of engaging deeply with today, you live mentally in a future version of your life. You fantasize about who you'll be, what you'll achieve, how things will look. But fantasy does not build fulfillment. Action in the present does. Fulfillment grows from progress, not from imagination. Another layer that often goes unnoticed is comparison. When you delay your own path, you naturally start measuring yourself against those who moved. You see others building, launching, transforming, and it stings. Not because you're incapable, but because you recognize you could have started too. Comparison hurts most when it highlights inaction. You must also understand that momentum is fragile. It thrives on quick decisions. It dies in overthinking. When you act immediately, you create flow. When you stall, you interrupt it. The longer the gap between intention and execution, the harder it is to restart. That's why people often say, "I just need to get back into it." It feels hard because the gap grew too wide. Let's be honest for a moment. How many times have you said you would start on Monday, or next month, or at the beginning of the year? Those time markers feel productive because they sound structured, but they often become psychological delays. You don't need a symbolic date. You need a decisive moment. The shift happens when you stop asking, "What if I fail?" and start asking, "What if I never begin?" Failure teaches. Delay teaches nothing. Failure gives feedback. Delay gives regret. Failure builds resilience. Delay builds doubt. If you truly want to eliminate the grip of someday, start by shortening the distance between thought and action. When you think, "I should," respond with, "How?" When you think, "I want to," respond with, "When?" Turn vague desire into specific movement. Turn emotion into execution. Because the real enemy is not lack of talent, lack of intelligence, or lack of opportunity. The real enemy is indefinite delay disguised as patience. And if you're hearing this, and something inside you feels exposed, that's not judgment. That's awareness waking up. Awareness is the beginning of change. But awareness without action becomes another form of someday. So right now, don't just agree with this message. Interrupt your pattern. Do something small before this video ends. Send the email, write the outline, schedule the appointment, make the call, take the step. And if this message pushed you to confront the word that's been quietly holding you back, stay connected to Psychovest. Because we don't build better lives by thinking about change. We build them by moving into it. There is also a quiet truth most people don't want to face. Every time you say, "someday," you are slowly training your mind to believe that your own voice is negotiable. When you tell yourself you will do something and you repeatedly move the timeline, your brain begins to treat your intentions like suggestions instead of commitments. Over time, this weakens your internal authority. You stop feeling urgency toward your own goals because deep down, you expect that you will delay them anyway. And when your mind stops taking your own words seriously, discipline becomes incredibly difficult to build. Think about the difference between someone who says, "I'll try to do it someday," and someone who says, "I'm starting now." The difference is not personality, it's not background, it's not luck. The difference is a decision about how seriously they take their own promises. People who transform their lives treat their commitments to themselves as real obligations, not optional ideas. When they say they will start, they move. Even if it's messy, even if it's uncomfortable, even if they're unsure what the next step will look like. Another thing that makes someday dangerous is how quietly it drains urgency from your life. Urgency is not panic. It's awareness that your time matters. It's the understanding that every day you delay something meaningful is a day that could have been building momentum. When urgency disappears, life becomes slower, softer, and more passive. You begin to drift through routines instead of directing them. You respond to circumstances instead of shaping them. And what's interesting is that many people think decisive action requires massive courage, but in reality, it often begins with something much simpler: honesty. Honest recognition that waiting is no longer helping you. Honest recognition that the conditions you're hoping for may never appear. Honest recognition that the version of you who takes action has to be built by the choices you make today, not by the wishes you carry into the future. When people finally break the someday pattern, it usually doesn't happen because life suddenly becomes easier. It happens because the cost of waiting becomes more painful than the discomfort of starting. The frustration builds, the internal tension grows, and eventually, something inside says, "I'm done postponing the life I keep talking about." That moment is powerful because it shifts your relationship with fear. Fear stops being the thing you avoid and becomes the signal that growth is nearby. The conversation changes in your mind. Instead of asking, "Am I ready?" you begin asking, "What's the smallest step I can take right now?" That question removes pressure. It removes perfection. It turns transformation into movement. And movement is everything. Momentum changes your psychology faster than motivation ever could. The moment you take a step, something inside you wakes up. You realize the world didn't collapse. You realize the action wasn't as impossible as your mind made it seem. One step leads to another. And suddenly, what once felt distant begins to feel possible. There's also something deeply empowering about becoming someone who acts when conviction appears. People begin to notice it. Opportunities begin to appear differently. Confidence begins to grow from real experience instead of imagination. You stop dreaming about who you could be and start collecting proof of who you are becoming. But this only happens when you break the spell of someday, because someday keeps everything theoretical. It keeps your future in a safe little box where nothing can challenge it, but nothing can build it either. At some point, you have to decide that your life is not a concept waiting for the right conditions. It is something that must be shaped in real time, through real decisions, taken by the version of you that exists right now, not the imaginary version you keep waiting to become. At the end of the day, the word someday seems small, but its impact on your life is enormous. It quietly delays the things that matter most. It pushes dreams further away without you noticing. It convinces you that you still have time, that the moment will come later, that a better version of you will eventually appear and handle everything you keep postponing. But the truth is much simpler and much more powerful. The future is not built by the version of you that exists someday. It is built by the decisions made by the person you are right now. Your life does not suddenly transform because the calendar changes, or because circumstances become perfect, or because motivation magically appears. It changes the moment you decide that your goals are important enough to act on today. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but deliberately. One step, one action, one decision that interrupts the habit of waiting. And when you look at the people who eventually build the lives they once only imagined, you will notice something very simple about them. They didn't eliminate fear. They didn't wait until everything made sense. They simply stopped allowing someday to be their answer. They replaced it with movement. They replaced it with responsibility. They replaced it with now. So before you leave this video, take a moment and ask yourself a brutally honest question. What is the one thing in your life that you keep pushing into the future? The one idea, the one decision, the one change you keep telling yourself you'll deal with someday. Because that thing right there might be the doorway to the next version of your life. And the only thing standing between you and that doorway is the moment you decide to walk through it. If this message spoke to you, don't just nod your head and move on. Turn this into a commitment. Comment the word "today" below as a promise to yourself that you are done waiting for someday. And if you want more content that challenges your thinking, strengthens your discipline, and pushes you to become the strongest version of yourself, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Psychovest. Because your future is not built by the plans you make for someday, it's built by the actions you take today.